This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and once again we have one of the shining lights of Macon's intellectual world, Dr. Buck Melton.
More like a 20-watt bulb.
Welcome, Buck. I generally start these conversations by trying to persuade you to embark on a political career. But are you just playing hard to get on this subject, or no?
I'll put it this way: I'm extremely hard to get.
Okay, well,
so,
that's
keep on trying.
That's the country's loss.
Yes.
That's the country's loss. Well, we've had conversations on many subjects, and many times there are things that relate to the sort of national identity arrangements, what's going on with the country, the changes that are underway in our nation. And one of the things that's appeared, the notion of sanctuary cities, and I'll just run through that briefly. So the idea is the federal government has put in different kinds of barriers to coming into the country, and initially, and you may, I'm going to ask you to opine on this a little bit, but traditionally it was open borders for anyone, and the idea was to really encourage immigration. However, the idea was you would be a European coming here, preferably a Protestant European.
Western Protestant European, fairly light skin.
Right, and with blue eyes possibly.
Yes.
So it had that sort of, I guess, initial immigration arrangements, and I think also the idea was that it was important to be a Protestant. Very important to be a Protestant.
I have a bit of trivia for you. Do you know what WASP stands for?
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Yes, and here's the interesting thing. It originally stood for Wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Is that right?
Yes.
It's sort of, is that right? So white and Anglo-Saxon obviously are
no freeloaders around.
Well, all right,
no freeloaders around.
I've learned something
Yes.
here. How about? Well, the idea is, that's an interesting point. There's a very sort of selective arrangement, and basically just the circumstances of the country produce this. Now, you said wealthy. The initial immigrants into the country were very poor, generally.
Yes.
The people that came from Britain, many of them came as indentured servants. That was apparently some huge percentage, maybe 90% of the population came in those circumstances, including some of my relatives. So they were serfs in the old country, and they came, at least initially, in that state of quasi-bondage. And a great number of Americans came under those circumstances. So the immigration was, you could say, open borders. Now, slaves and Afro-Americans came in other circumstances, so their story is a different story in regards to their immigration arrangements. But having gone through all of this, I guess, journey. After the Civil War, the idea was, well, everyone can be a citizen. It really opened the doors. Can you comment on that, the post-Civil War amendments?
Yes, the Civil Rights Act of 1966 was designed to end Southern white discrimination in the wake of the Civil War by essentially saying if you're born in the United States, that makes you a United States citizen. And this was later incorporated into the text of the 14th Amendment, which we added in 1868. And it's the first line. If you're born in the United States, you're a United States citizen, you got all the rights of United States citizenship. And this was designed to explicitly overrule the old Dred Scott ruling that said African Americans
are property. You're not a citizen. Yes. So we had that circumstance, and there was enormous encouragement for immigration, and there were no immigration boundaries as far as I know of. And the thing at Ellis Island, you could come if, in fact, you were healthy enough to get in. And
yes.
there might have been
and
some
essentially
ideas.
No passports either. I mean, passports, as we understand them, didn't really come in until World War I, in the wake of World War I.
So people would just come here,
yes.
and here I am, and I'd like to go to work, and I'll learn English, and I'll be part of the American fabric. And things rolled along, and actually great waves of immigrants came, particularly from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, people fleeing anti-Semitism or also fleeing conscription in the Tsar's army and the Kaiser's army. So many people came to enrich the country. And the first, as I understand it, immigration restriction occurred in the 1920s. Do you have any comments about that?
Yes, that was when and you had seen some eyebrows going up before then.
I mean, I think,
yes,
in
Chinese
California
immigration,
there was,
instance,
and
yes.
that was
and
very
Japanese, the gentleman's
so
agreement.
there were limitations on the West Coast.
Yes, yes.
That were put in place, legal limitations to coming in, I think.
Yes, and there was a very interesting case, and I can't remember when it was. It's like the 1890s, when a fairly well-known, I believe it was an Anglican Episcopal church in Washington, D.C., hired a minister from England. And technically, that hiring was a violation of the immigration statute on the books at the time. And the Supreme Court just gave him a free pass. This guy speaks English, he's a WASP.
Right.
And obviously the immigration law was not drafted with people like him in mind.
Right.
So in he came. But yes, in the 1920s, once again, in reaction to the spread of communism, the Red Scare, radicalism, syndicalism, you saw some very big nativist movements. The KKK just expanded dramatically, and you saw that reflected in immigration law.
So there was, and the idea was there was a very limited access to the U.S. You had each country had quotas. You couldn't just show up here any longer. The doors were closed.
Yes.
And it was particularly tragic for people fleeing the Nazis, the Jewish people trying to get in, or anyone as far as that goes. That was came from a country where their quota had been filled.
Yes.
And many tragic stories about that. People sort of maroons trying to escape the Nazis and,
yes.
and couldn't.
And the preference, of course, even for under quota, were for, once again, the W for wealthy people who had some sort of valuable skill, somebody who would not be a burden on the public fisc, somebody who could pull his own weight. And that's the way it was down to the 60s, really.
And I mean, another thing that I think happened, just is noteworthy about we're going to get to sanctuary cities, but in World War II, there was a program to bring Mexican workers into the United States because there was a shortage of labor. So many Mexican, mostly men, came and then worked picking vegetables or whatever, manual labor. There was a huge program. I mean, substantially over 1 million people here doing that. And then when the war ended, people were sent home. They were guest workers, kind of the German
yes.
model, and then everyone left after that.
Yes.
And so we had this situation with restricted immigration, and I think also the way that the Immigration Act was passed in the 1920s was that the people coming in had to reflect percentage-wise the people already here.
Correct.
So in other words, if there was no one from I don't know wherever, from Egypt, then we had like 1.111% of Egyptian population. Well, the quota was 100 people.
It was geared into that, yes.
Yes, and of course Africa was another matter, which you could say, well, what happened there?
Yes.
I mean, there's at least 10% of the population, but the quotas were certainly tilted toward bringing in Western European.
What we already had.
Right,
yes.
right. And then events took place, an enormous change in the national psyche in the early 1960s. I think it's 1965, this extraordinary act was passed to really, I think, and Ted Kennedy really pioneered this. It was part of the Great Society. So over 50 years ago, the immigration policy changed substantially.
Yes, and of course Kennedy, from the good Irish Catholic family,
Right.
was, very conscious of his sort of recent arrival status.
Right.
So.
Although, he's a very aristocratic guy.
Yes.
the Boston Brahmins, many people would consider the Kennedys very aristocratic, and but they felt the boot of the Boston Brahmins that were
Yes.
trying to exclude them from their world.
Yes.
I should say that. So they were anxious to open doors, and in fact, the country's history was everyone always benefited from immigration. I mean, it's just the benefits the country received were extraordinary. In the ratio of land and resources to people, more people make the country more productive and fertile, and it's really a very useful situation that occurred. So the immigration laws changed, and then I think one of the things that happened in there was the so-called chain migration arrangement. So, and I think it was put in there by people that wanted more, I don't know, people from Sweden to show up here. So if we bring your family members, but it just so happened that people from Western Europe no longer particularly wanted to come here.
Correct, yes.
And so we had this huge demographic change, huge numbers of immigrants coming in legally. And that's that. And I think President Trump is discussing chain migration, which is another matter. But we have really an extraordinary alteration in just the demographics of the country. And it's happened over the past 50 years, and adjusting to that has its issues to try and do that. So the country has to kind of move along to accept all this. And the other thing that's happened, and we finally get to our sanctuary city story here, is there are huge numbers of illegal immigrants that are coming in, and I think what happened, if I can recollect this, was lots of people were coming in across the border, and I think in about 1986, the idea was, I think President Reagan did this, if I'm right on that. Is that right?
That sounds right, yes.
Yeah, and we're going to just legalize everyone here, and then that'll take care of the problem, and that will just enforce the border arrangements. And actually, that just turned out to be that policy certainly did not work, did it?
No,
it did not work. And the situation we have, an enormous number of the people in the world are in bad economic circumstances. There's no safety net. There's nothing, and their life is extremely unpleasant. And if they can get to the U.S., things will be much better. And it's still quite difficult to come. I mean, there are lots of encumbrances to someone off the street just showing up and coming here legally. It's expensive, it's difficult, there are barriers attached to it. So it's hard to do that. And so the idea is to come illegally, and the border is a porous border. One of the things that happened when President Reagan legalized all these people that were illegally is that you had communities all in different parts of the country that had large populations, particularly of Hispanic descent, that were there as kind of a catcher's mitt for anyone else that wanted to come in. So if you showed up in, I don't know, a New England town and you stood out a lot, but if one could make it into San Francisco or Los Angeles, it's a huge, extraordinary community there, and there was no problem. So we have this issue where we have lots and lots of people that have done that, and we have a real national dialogue about what to do under these circumstances. And I'm going to throw the ball back to you in a second. But the idea is that one reason that President Trump was elected was, let's build this wall, let's stop this, and on and on. And actually, not too much has happened. Stop chain migration, pretty tough to do that. Try and do something about enforcing immigration laws, pretty tough to do that. And there's been a substantial blowback, particularly from California and other places, where the idea, just to state their point, is we have a wonderful community here with thousands and not millions of people that are here illegally that are making tremendous contributions to the place. They're wonderful people. Their children are nice. It would be an evil, wicked thing to expel them from the country. Wicked and evil, what the country would lose, and they would particularly lose. So we have a responsibility to accept the circumstances that have just happened and integrate them into our community. And if we were to try and enforce these immigration restrictions, that would cause them to be less likely to report crime. It would injure these people if they had the fear of this. So we're kind, generous people. We've always been that way, this American tradition. So let's just let everyone stay here unless they cause trouble. And if they're criminals, we accept the idea they will accept that. On the other hand, we're not going to collaborate with a government that basically is a 19th century arrangement where they believe that this is the country for people from Western Europe. Instead, it's the country from anyone that wishes to come here or can get here, and it'll all work out in the end just fine. Okay, maybe that's their argument. Now, so what they've done is basically, and I'm going to get some legal opinions now, they've passed laws, as I understand this, saying that in California particularly, we're not going to collaborate with the U.S. Immigration Service, and if you do, you're going to be guilty. We'll charge you with a state crime if you make an effort to try and collaborate with innocent illegal immigrants that are here with their families that are enjoying life. And the federal government is apparently going to take the state to court. Now, where are we in this? Can you now say we have this complicated national dialogue going on with a state that's in many ways contravening or defying the national government?
Well, I think to a degree, and it comes back to our unique arrangement of federalism, which of course goes back to the founding of the country and before. And we've been here before. As you were describing the sanctuary city status or even sanctuary state status, the type of law that immediately occurred to me were the personal liberty laws passed by northern states in the decades leading up to the Civil War. That the federal government had a Fugitive Slave Act, which it passed in the early 1790s, which enforced a fugitive slave provision of the U.S. Constitution that essentially said if a slave escapes to a free state, he doesn't become free. He's still a slave and has to be returned to slavery.
Now, is that in the U.S. Constitution?
That is in the U.S. Constitution.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, I certainly, I thought I knew everything. I asked my wife, I don't know everything, but
yes.
Is that right? I mean, is that in the Constitution?
It absolutely is.
Wow, a fugitive slave law is in the, wow.
I believe it's in Article 4.
Is that right?
Now, the interesting thing is it does not use the word slave because the word slave made the founders too queasy. So the euphemism was persons held to service or labor. Escaping from one state into another shall not be absolved of their obligation of service or labor thereby.
Wow, that's in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution.
Wow.
And so northern states, as you begin to see the abolitionist movement grow, especially in Quaker states like Pennsylvania,
yes.
Or Massachusetts, which of course had a very strong tradition of being, shall we say, nonconformist, simply passed laws saying, well, that's fine, but these alleged slaves are going to have certain legal rights under state law. Before we will deliver them up to the slave catchers or to the alleged slave owners. There's going to be a jury trial. They're going to be able to put on evidence to show that, no, they didn't escape slavery, that they've been in Pennsylvania all along. So you had a very clear circumstance there of a state government passing laws designed to obstruct federal law.
And so just to go through this, I mean, that's quite a comparison. You could say there was some similarity in those circumstances.
Yes.
So if you were a Quaker in 1840 in Philadelphia, now your great-great-grandson is located in Santa Barbara, and you're in California. So you likewise are going to look after people that are here and might be expelled back to what could be considered a horrible life. They've fled into Pennsylvania, and the people, we want to put you back in this horrible set of circumstances. And if you leave, you don't speak, well, I mean, you certainly don't speak Spanish that well. You've grown up here, and they send you back to rural Guadalajara, where you know no one, there's no job, there's no work, you might starve, or it's going to be an awful life. It's quite similar, isn't it?
Yes, yes. So it's, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Well, so what was the resolution of it turned out to be a bad story.
It's a very bad story.
If the next shoe to drop there is,
yes,
many people were outraged that the Constitution was not being followed, and their as they considered their property, quotes, were escaping from them, and they lost a substantial amount of money. They were being mocked in Philadelphia, and all these tensions happened.
Yes.
And didn't that play a big part in the idea of the Confederacy? People
Yes.
said, we just can't stand this anymore. That the Constitution, the laws aren't being enforced, and these, in some ways, Pennsylvania is sort of out of the Union, kind of,
yes,
by putting these laws in place that contravene the Supreme Court and the Constitution.
Yes. Well, the immediate, a short-term comment, a longer-term comment, the immediate effect was the passage of a new Federal Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 that took a much harsher approach to this. It said that this is a matter of federal law, and the states were just cutting out of the loop completely, that we're going to hire federal commissioners that the slave catchers can go before, and so the states will just have no say at all.
So it's kind of like, I mean, it's not the same, I take that point, but it was like the Immigration Service is out there catching people and sending
Essentially,
them.
yes. And so we don't need these state officers to
Right.
be
We're
reporting
just going to
anything.
take them and that's it.
Yes. The longer-term comment, though, is that if you use the phrase states' rights, especially if you use it in the South, everybody immediately associates states' rights with Southern secession and the Confederacy and slavery. We're seceding, segregation. And that is not at all the case. States' rights, or state sovereignty, as some people would choose to call it, would be a card played by any state that did not have sufficient clout to get a national policy bending in its direction. So, for instance, in the Hartford Convention of 1815, the Federalists of New England were very angry that the Jeffersonian Republicans were just completely ignoring New England's economic interests.
In the War of 1812.
Yes, and there were rumbles of secession.
Right, right.
In the Abelman versus Booth case in 1859, I believe it was the Wisconsin Supreme Court that essentially said, we are not going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1815. The feds can just go to blazes. So,
this is the same. This is the same story. It's just a normal story.
Yes.
But now, and the tensions this is causing with all the other dynamics in the country, it's pretty substantial, isn't it?
Yes.
So if your viewpoint is, well, this law is there, and California refused to enforce the law, what does that mean? And it means that the demographics of the country are going to change and change and change because of the extraordinarily, I guess, population growth in Latin America, where there's huge population growth. There are millions, not millions, but very high reproductive rate. Lots and lots of people that are just don't have a place in society, and a porous border, and all sorts of benefits that occur to them when they arrive. So huge pull of people. And the other point about the American Southwest is the U.S. in many ways is an artificial country. It just sort of hatched out.
Yes.
And I think Mexican people would say they have that's their country, that's their land.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that's in the cards with the whole idea of sanctuary cities, the idea that you can come here, is the demographics are going to become more and more tilted to splintering the country. And the other thing that's out there when this, in regards to political arrangements of the country, is that almost everybody is a Democratic voter that's showing up there.
Yes.
So if you look at the demographics of the place, that's going to have a powerful impact. And you can say that you can mention Georgia in this. Is just unfortunately, I think the ethnicity arrangements play such a powerful role in who you vote, what
Yes.
country or what party you're in, and people that feel vulnerable and benighted. They believe the Democratic Party would be their protector, and the Democratic Party holds themselves out as the protector.
Yes.
So if you're a Democratic politician and you see you're trying to find some kind of successful political career, the obvious thing in your advantage and for your belief system would be to basically just overwhelm the traditional Republican constituencies with many, many, many people that are here legally.
Yes.
And then soon the situation will be, in fact, I think it's supposed to happen by 2050. The
Yes.
The majority will become a minority, and presumably the political power of the left, if one can say that,
Yes.
will arrive. Yes.
And this whole pattern got started with a Democrat named Ted Kennedy. It's in 1965.
Yes.
Yeah, we could take an entire half hour unpacking this last comment of yours that the fate of the American Southwest is going to be decided not on the battlefield but the bedroom. The fact that upper economic groups, for instance, Americans, have always traditionally been a lot more thorough users of birth control than lower income groups. The fact that really one of the worst chapters in our history as a nation, the United States, was the Mexican War of 1848, when essentially we dragged Mexico into a dark alley and mugged it, and almost literally forced the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on it at gunpoint. That is certainly the Mexicans' understanding and account of it. When I was in graduate school, I had a friend who had been a Mexican lawyer in Mexico City, and he told me very clearly and very explicitly, without any rancor, but he was not kidding around, that Mexicans, many Mexicans, himself included, considered that an illegitimate treaty, and that the American Southwest, California, New Mexico, Arizona, was rightfully Mexican territory.
Don't forget Texas.
And,
don't forget
yes,
Texas.
yeah.
I mean, so you could say that the Anglos took half of Mexico,
Yes.
and that's a card in the deck with this sanctuary city arrangement. So if you've come from Guadalajara there, you say, well, I'm really in my own country here.
Yes.
And when I come in, there's Spanish television, this and that. I'm protected, and it's a powerful, I guess, message of things to come.
Yes.
In regards to the arrangements the country has. And it's hard to say how all this is going to work itself out, but many people would say, I live in San Diego, and Tijuana, Baja I shouldn't have any problem in going to Baja. Well, why do I have this border in front of me?
Yes. I mean, it's going back to one of our earlier conversations, the question of the relevancy of national boundaries, of national borders. So in this case, maybe it's illusory.
Well, one can hope that the courts work this out, and it would appear to me, just from a neutral position, that the U.S. laws should be enforced. If we can't enforce those laws, we have a lot of problems, because each of the states will sort of assert their own ideas,
Yes.
and conservative states will start to do that.
Yes.
If the government can't enforce their national laws, they'll be whatever. I mean, and we'll have a very difficult time of it.
Yes.
But we can hope that people of goodwill will work this out.
One can always hope.
Well, okay, Bucky.
So,
thanks for being here
thank you,
once
sir.
again. Thank you. It's great to have you. Great. Well,
Find you something you didn't. Well, you usually know more.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.